Welcome. This is Paul Andrews with the Mass Association of School Superintendents, and it's glad to be with you today. Just a couple of things before we introduce the program. One is to thank you all for your comments that you've made to some of the proposals that have gone out to you relative to the school finance legislation. I'm sure you're going to hear this a few times during the course of this presentation, and that is that we certainly need your help to reach out to the senators and representatives and to their staff around the issues that were mentioned in our position relative to additional funding for education. But also, along with that, I'd like to introduce to you presenters for today. Before I do that, because I don't want to forget it. And that is that this production and broadcast and distribution of this webinar to you wouldn't be possible without Alexa Lucy of Sterling Technology, who does a fantastic job with us on all of these webinars. I'd like to introduce, first of all, the superintendent of schools in the city of Walpole, Link Lynch, who is with us as a financial advisor and has been for some time now, as well as his sidekick today is Roger Hatch, well known, by the way, at the Department of Education and the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education as the retired administrator of school finance. It's always a joy to have him, as a member of consultant staff here at MASS and part of a development of some of the new paperwork that has already gone out, as well as I would say he passed on the word to me today that he considers school budget much like the Boston Red Sox. So you're going to hear that explained, I think, in more details by you, Roger, during the course of the presentation, if I got that right, by the way. I'm sure I didn't get it precisely right, but that's okay. I'm close. So with that, let me turn it over first to open our presentation is going to be Roger. So Roger can reach right into the Red Sox, by the way, with an explanation of that. And obviously, we'll go from there over to Link, and they interchange during that process. So again, we look forward to having you aboard. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Paul. It's good to be here with you today and with Lincoln. Yes, why is school finance like baseball? Well, I've used this analogy many times over the years. Long stretches of boredom and inactivity is what you've got with school finance, and in some ways with baseball too. During those long stretches, you prepare. In the case of school finance, you work on the numbers, make sure that they're right. So that when the moments of high drama do come, in the case of baseball, maybe you have a 0-0 game in the sixth inning, and all of a sudden, lots of hits and home runs break out, and there's high drama. Likewise, in school finance, after those long stretches of inactivity and boredom, you get some very passionate people talking about, their schools, what they think's right, what they passionately think is wrong. And likewise, as with baseball, you have to be prepared for those dramatic moments. You have to put in the preparation. And so that's my analogy. Today, we're going to talk about, well, it's going to be a heavy dose of Chapter 70. But we're also going to talk about the state budget process and some of the other appropriations and the education accounts. So let's just briefly begin with a summary of the state budget process. In December, there's a consensus revenue estimate. And I should mention that recent news is that the estimate for this year, I believe the number was $400 million lower than what had been anticipated. And so we've seen that happen in the past, and then by the end of the year, everything's fine. They may have a surplus, but we do have to be cautious about fiscal 19, even as we're talking about fiscal 20. The governor's budget, okay, we've seen that. It came out at the end of January. We're going to talk about that today. In early April, we have the House Ways and Means and the House final budget, followed by the Senate Ways and Means in May, Senate final, usually May or June. And the two will get together, the House and Senate, to work out any differences. That'll happen in June, and the governor has the opportunity to make any vetoes or approve, usually in June or July. And if the legislature feels so compelled, by July, they usually make any vetoes. So is this the year, when we're finally going to see education reform legislation? I'm talking about real legislation here. I do want to point out that it's not quite accurate what you read in the papers and the press, and hear some of your colleagues say, which is Chapter 70 has not been looked at or reviewed, in 25 years. That really does little justice to those, organizations, legislators, the people at ESE, everyone who's concerned about the formula. It has been looked at, and there have been a couple. Well, there was one Foundation Budget Review Commission in 1996. There was another legislative commission in 2000. And then, of course, we had the 2015 Foundation Budget Review Commission. So, in between those 3 points in time, every year, the formula does get looked at. And in fact, there were some major changes that occurred in 2007. I should mention, too, that, the formula has been the subject of a couple big court cases, the last one being Hancock, which actually was found in favor of the Commonwealth. And, during the course of that, the formula was looked at very carefully. So, yes, the foundation budget itself is still primarily based upon assumptions that were made back 25 years ago. We have to admit that. But some changes have occurred even in the last couple of years where the legislature and governor have put in place increments in health insurance, and last year ELL. So there have been changes. It's not quite fair to say the formula has not been reviewed. But now we're lucky enough to have, I think, a good consensus among most parties that there needs to be substantial legislative change. And so we have the governor's proposal, which is House 70. We have a Senate Bill 101 filed by Senator Chang Diaz. I point out that that's filed by her and not by the Education Committee. So nevertheless, it is very similar to what the proposal was from the Senate and passed by the Senate last summer. We have a number of different House bills that have been filed. The closest one to what the House passed last summer was, or is, House 3195, filed by Representative Tucker. So those are the three big proposed legislation that we're looking at right now. And I do want to mention that MASS has come up after much deliberation with its executive committee and others, getting feedback from the field, with a number of different school finance priorities. And I'll let Lincoln talk about those.
Thank you, Roger. Good morning. Lincoln Lynch, Superintendent in Walpole. To give you a perspective, I have 4,000 students, 25,000 population. It's a suburban community, 15 miles south of Boston. If it were 15,000 miles, I'd probably be down in Antarctica somewhere. But so the executive board, and I would defer a lot of specifics. I know Brad Jackson was very involved with this proposal. I heard him speak at a legislative breakfast on Friday, as well as I chimed in about circuit breaker. Talks about not only about fully funding foundation budget, but also we also must agree to be accountable and transparent. And I believe many of us that isn't a stretch. I think we've all become very transparent through necessity over the years, only with our school committees, finance committees, town council, city council, etc. But we talk about foundation budget, and people have to be cautious, because even if the foundation budget is adjusted, many districts have to be cognizant that they may only receive minimum aid. So even though you hear a lot about foundation budget, I would suggest to at least 189 school districts in the state that you should keep an eye on the minimum aid and have conversations with your legislators and House and Senate about focusing on that piece of the foundation budget, in addition to the recommendations of the committee. We're currently at $20 per pupil. I know for me, with 4,000 students, that means about $89,000. Another thing you have to be concerned about is the interplay with the increase in the foundation budget. How does that impact your circuit breaker reimbursement? If your foundation budget increases, your threshold before you receive reimbursement on 4 times state average would also increase. And what would be the net result? Also, charter schools may be impacted, and school choice, I would think. So there's a lot at play that you have to be aware of. You also have to understand that if you're from a suburban community, your motivation to adjust the foundation budget may be different from an urban center, and they have needs sometimes in the extreme that need to be addressed too. So I think that we need to work together. We can't be self-serving. And I know you're maybe responsible for your own budget, but we also have to realize that all boats must rise. And if we have 189 districts that only receive minimum aid and aren't happy, then that may impact the vote overall for foundation budget review adjustments. And I don't think any of us want that to happen. So, if you can keep an eye on those different dynamics, and feel free to reach out to us if you'd like to drill down on that with your particular school district. But I would just say that there is a document that we will post called from MASS called the Executive Summary. We'll post that on the website, make that available to you. And you have to understand that it not only talks about foundation budget reserve, it also talks about circuit breaker, per pupil aid, accountability. So like anything we do, there are many facets to the story that you need to be aware of. So I'm going to turn this back to Roger for the time being.
Okay, we are completely cognizant of the fact that you in local districts may look at all these various proposals and it's confusing. What are you supposed to do? Okay, so my feeling is the best you can do is go with the preliminary numbers that have already been published. We may hear very grandiose plans for much higher aid amounts coming out of the legislature. And in fact, that has been the pattern over the years, especially with the minimum aid. Although really the recent years, the increase in minimum aid has not been all that substantial. It's seldom that the legislature would provide less aid than what has been proposed by the governor. So that's good news. But, you know, all these various proposals have a lot to do with the foundation budget. And when we're talking about Chapter 70, any change in the foundation budget is going to change not necessarily the aid. You may still just get minimum aid, but it's definitely going to change the contributions because the formula starts with a premise that 59% of the statewide foundation budget will be covered by local contributions. So if foundation budget goes up, then contributions are likely to go up. It's possible for them to go down in some cases as well. And so the main point is the contributions are very subject to change if the foundation budget changes. That's particularly a problem for regional districts. If you're a regional budget maker, what are you supposed to do? When all you have is the preliminary numbers, you know that in the House and Senate, there's a good chance that the foundation budget will change. Therefore, your contributions are going to change. Your assessments can go either up or down. So you can't really guess at what the House and the Senate are going to do. When you're doing your budget, all you can do is use the preliminary numbers. And if indeed, in the end, in the final budget, the contributions change, well, you may find there are ways to deal with that through supplemental budgets or other ways. We've seen that happen a number of years in the past. House and Senate Chapter 70 details are not published by ESE. So, you know, we're going to show you in a moment how you can go on the ESE website if you haven't done so already. And you can, you know, find an exquisite detail on all you'd want to know about the Chapter 70 formula, as well as some of the other budget accounts. And why are the House and Senate Chapter 70 details not published by ESE? That would create even more confusion because what would you do? Pick and choose between what you like the most between the House and the Senate? I think it would, that way lies madness. And so it's probably a good thing that ESE publishes the numbers in January and then waits for the final budget to be published in July. Having said that, I do want to point out that the cherry sheet at Division of Local Services at Revenue does report aid amounts in the various aid accounts on the cherry sheet as the budget process unfolds. So I don't know if, having just said that the ESE is trying to avoid confusion and then pointing out that the cherry sheet actually shows you the process all along the way. I don't know if that's done for the purpose of causing confusion or what, but anyway, the big point here is all you can do at this point is start with the preliminary numbers and try to follow the state budget process as closely as you can.
Sure. You know, I think along the way, when you go on the website and you look at your projected additional aid, you may want to work with your town administrator, if possible, to make I would say a reserve account if possible, like for example, I've gone to my town administrator and asked for a circuit breaker reserve account in the event that circuit breaker remains level funded as it is in the governor's budget. Um, so you may not have to get that money added to your budget, but potentially you could, for example, in a town, add it to a finance committee's reserve account in the event that circuit breaker um, comes in less than you anticipate. Um, you could compensate for that. I know that I rely on circuit breaker on an annual basis to offset my appropriation. Some towns do have a year or two lag to see what the money comes in at, and then they budget appropriately the following year. We don't have that luxury where I am because our state aid has only increased about 2% or less a year over the past 5 to 10 years. Um, so I think this seminar this morning, this webinar this morning, should make you aware of not only do you need to look at your foundation budget and the amount projected, but also look at your other revenue sources and create a big picture if you need to work with your school business administrator on that. For example, circuit breaker, Medicaid reimbursement, your state and federal grants, and make sure you have a good grasp of the overall picture. I'm speaking to a lot of the inexperienced superintendents now because I do see a few on the list. So all you veterans, we'll just have to listen for a minute. But I would just suggest that you understand your personnel budget. Should be your Bible. It's 80 to 85% of your budget. Know how your teachers are moving in and out of the budget based on retirements, resignations, attrition, and how that could even help you with your balance your budget for next year. And just remember, budget integrity is the main thing. That you want to be on the same page with your business manager and your chairman of your school committee. You don't want to get to a finance committee and have different numbers and look at each other quizzically, because that could open up a window that you don't want the naysayers coming through to drive a wedge between you and the policymakers. So know your budget, know your foundation budget, and whatever we can do to help. We're here beyond today. I just wanted to make that point too. So Roger, if you want.
This slide shows the DLS Cherry Sheet Estimate website. You can go on there, plug in your city or town or regional district. There's a separate section there for regional districts. And it'll show you, as you go through, you see the fiscal 19 numbers, and then the governor's proposal, House, Senate, conference. They'll show final when that's available as well. All right, before launching into Chapter 70 in more detail, let's take a look at the major education accounts. Chapter 70 goes up $200.9 million. That's the largest increase in quite some time. And it incorporates, many of the proposals that the governor has put forth in House 70, which is his education aid proposal. Circuit breaker goes up $5 million. Now that is not 75%, and MASS has joined a lot of organizations and input from the field in proposing that SPED be fully funded at 75%. I believe that the Mass SPED Coalition has estimated that that would cost $353 million, so they'd need another $30 million in the account.
That's great.
To be at 75%. Charter reimbursements. Okay, now this is a proposed change in the House 70 legislation put forth by the governor. There's an increase of 16 million, and there's also some change to the way the formula works. As you know, we've had for almost a decade a paradigm by which transition aid looks at your increase in charter school tuition, and for any given year, you get some percentage of that aid, that being 100% in the first year and then 25% of that amount in the subsequent 5 years. And so that's staggered over time. Unfortunately, it has never been fully funded. The most they were able to accomplish was 4 years. And in recent years, it's all been just the first year, and not even that was fully funded. And so we reached the point where in fiscal 19, the entitlement is, the state appropriation as a percentage of the entitlement is 55%. And that's been going down year after year after year. So what the governor is proposing is to go back to having a 3-year transition period. And one big change would be to have it based upon enrollment change instead of tuition change. And that would go back to being 100%, 60%, 40% over 3 years. It limits the entitlement to just those districts that have growth in enrollment. And also it adds in supplemental aid that looks to give out a small amount of money. It's 5.4 billion, a million, sorry, to districts where their charter tuition is very high compared to their state aid. And really that just affects 3 districts, and almost all of it goes to Boston. Up Island and Edgartown managed to get the remaining 0.1 million out of the 5.4. I've just been asked to remind you that if you have questions as we're going along here, forward them to us online, and then we can answer them as promptly as possible. So the charter reimbursement program, the $16 million increase is great. You look at that, and also if you look at the percentage being funded, it goes from 55 all the way up to 77%, and you look at that and say, great. They're finally making some progress. In fact, their proposal specifically says there'll be a 3-year phase-in by the end point of which this would be 100% funded. So that's good, but the fact is the entitlement has gone down. So last year the entitlement was 162 million. This year it's down to 137 million. Fewer districts benefit because of the way that the formula was slightly redesigned to focus just on the biggest, the districts affected by the most charter tuition. And I'd remind you, as Lincoln pointed out, that changes in foundation budget affect the charter program as well, because the charter rates are built directly upon foundation budget assumptions. So when, and all these changes that have been proposed by the governor to increase the foundation have had the effect of raising rates and therefore tuition that districts pay to charter schools. Not only that, but the number of kids participating in the Commonwealth Charter School program has gone up. Last year it was this year in fiscal 19, 43,548. Now it's up to 46,504. And tuition has risen 11% from 643 million up to 716 million. And so, the entitlement for charter reimbursements keeps rising, and it's going to, as long as there are increases in foundation budget. And in fact, everyone's hoping there will be increases in foundation budget. Aside from that, the major education accounts are level funded. Oh, the exception of foundation reserve, that goes down to zero, but that was a one-time sort of program that was intended to cover the costs associated with children who moved from the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico as a result of the hurricanes a couple years ago. So now let's talk about Chapter 70. The preliminary Chapter 70 is built around the House 70 proposal, and it's phased in over 7 years. The 4 major areas of Foundation Budget Review Commission proposals are phased in beginning in fiscal 20. Health insurance, there's a change in the rates. Up until this point, the 2 years of change that we've seen have still been based upon what was the numbers that the Foundation Budget Review Commission put forth, 5 years ago. And importantly, with health insurance, there's a process put in place in House 70 that would update the rates based upon GIC Commission insurance rates for both current insurees and also retired teachers who are insured. Remember, retired teachers were not counted in the original foundation budget, and FBRC proposed that they should be included, and indeed they have been the last couple of years. And this would make it an annual recalculation. People refer to it as inflation, but really it's just getting the average of the GIC rates. So